This is Australia, a landmass we see as this large Pacific island. With that concept, Australia can be defined as having these fixed boundaries. Or you can go further and include these islands. What we see are these fixed boundaries for the world's fourth largest continuous landmass. However, the answer to how big Australia really is can be a bit more complex. First, we have to stop imagining Australia as a fixed, bounded landmass, because the continent isn't just this. The Commonwealth has quite a few external territories made up entirely of islands that cover almost as much area as the mainland itself. Some even claim that Australia extends as far as the middle of the Malay Archipelago. Depending on who you ask, you can find a lot of Australia amongst a few vibrant oceanic straits surrounding the continent. Starting at this northern tip with the Torres Strait. Starting from the Cape York Peninsula, the Torres Strait stretches 150 kilometres north right to the edge of Papua New Guinea. From east to west, the strait is over 300 kilometres long. More than 270 islands and reefs can be found across this stretch, 17 of which are inhabited by the Torres Strait Islanders. Ethnically, the Torres Strait Islanders are different from Aboriginal Australians. Migrating from the Indonesian archipelago, the islanders are believed to have settled in the Torres Strait about 2,500 years ago. Due to their semi-marginal location, Torres Strait Islanders weren't invaded by the early European invaders. It was in 1879 that the Torres Strait Islands were annexed by Queensland, becoming part of the British colony of Queensland. The islands later became part of the Australian state of Queensland and are still administered from there. The Torres Strait is 15 metres deep, and a diverse set of land and marine ecosystems can be found on its islands and the surrounding waters. Marine animals of the islands include the rare sea mammal dugong. Green, hawksbill and flatback sea turtles also frequent the waters along with saltwater crocodiles. About 6,000 Torres Strait Islanders still live in their native homes, and another 60,000 have moved to mainland Australia, mostly in Queensland. The most famous of these islanders is Eddie Koiki Mabo, the foremost campaigner for Indigenous land rights. As a result of his persistent activism, the High Court of Australia overturned the legal doctrine of terra nullius in 1992. In the aftermath, the islands were the first place in Australia where native title was recognised under Australian law. So, the Torres Strait is one of the more significant parts of Australia, even if it's not well recognised internationally. But the Torres Strait isn't the only neglected part of Australia on the world map. Depending on how you define the continent, Australia can go right up to the Wallace Line. Wallace Line. An imaginary frontier, the Wallace Line effectively separates the faunal regions of Asia and Australia. Understanding the Wallace Line can also help us understand how the Earth's continents were shaped by geological forces. More specifically, the Wallace Line separates the biogeographical realms of Southeast Asia and Australia. The idea for an imaginary line based on animal distribution was floated by British naturalist Alfred Russel Wallace. A peer of Charles Darwin, Wallace discovered the line when he spent years in the Malay Archipelago. While collecting plant species there, Wallace noticed that there was a clear division between the fauna of the Western Islands, which were very similar to those of mainland Southeast Asia, and the fauna of the Eastern Islands, which were much more similar to those of Australia. So, for example, to the west of the line, you'll find species, including elephants, tigers, rhinos, and orangutans. Animals are generally found in Asia. But on the eastern side, you'll find marsupials like the cuscus, monotremes, or the Komodo dragon. There is one exception to this rule in the form of the marsupial sugar glider, which is found both west and east of the Wallace Line. Wallace's imaginary line started in the Indian Ocean, cutting between Bali and Lombok, around Borneo, and to the east of the Philippines. He found that this division, mere kilometres away from each other, was due to the separation of the two regions by a deep sea trench. This trench is the 250-metre deep Lombok Strait, which has prevented the exchange of species since the Pleistocene Ice Age. This was when the islands of Bali, Java and Sumatra remained connected to the mainland of Asia. However, the connection to Australia was broken. Today, this transitional zone separates the Sunda Shelf from the Sahel Shelf. Based on this, we can say that the Wallace Line acts as a biogeographic boundary for Australia, and Australia extends up to here. The Wallace Line separation does not stop there. As I said earlier, Wallace was here collecting plant specimens. To the west of the line, we find tropical rainforests and an abundance of Dipterocarpaceae trees, while the east is dominated by eucalyptus and acacia woodlands. That's because of the difference between available nutrients in the soil on both sides of the Wallace Line. Looking beyond the diverse flora and fauna on either side of the Wallace Line, we can notice significant differences in geology, topography, and climate. The islands to the west of the line are characterized by volcanic activity, while the islands to the east are mostly non-volcanic. Meanwhile, the western islands are usually mountainous, and the eastern islands are flatter. This does create a unique yet very clear divide marked by the Wallace Line, keeping the flora and fauna of Australia separate from those of Asia. The Wallace Line is certainly very interesting and gives a new perspective on the actual size of Australia, but so does a strait to the south that is deeper and wider than the Torres Strait. Tasmania and the Bass Strait. For much of its history, Australia was joined to New Guinea, forming a landmass called Sahul. But after the end of the last ice age, some 18,000 years ago, warming caused sea levels to rise, drowning some major land masses across the world. That same process split the supercontinent of Sahul into New Guinea and Australia, also cutting Tasmania off from the mainland. With a small population and an ideal climate, Tasmania is one of Australia's more important regions. However, it is somewhat overlooked by mainlanders. For example, in 1982, Tasmania was left off the map at the Commonwealth Games opening ceremony in Brisbane. The same happened at the 2014 Commonwealth Games in Glasgow, when the swimming team's costume featured a map of Australia with no room for Tasmania. Despite these oversights, Tasmania is very much a part of Australia. Separating Tasmania from Victoria is the Bass Strait, with a maximum length of 500 kilometres and a maximum width of 350 kilometres. Like Australia's borders, there is a debate regarding the location of the Bass Strait. According to the International Hydrographic Organization, the Bass Strait forms a part of the Indian Ocean, but it is also believed to be part of the Pacific Ocean. Interestingly, the Bass Strait was not always a strait. A plain populated by indigenous peoples who moved back and forth between Victoria and Tasmania. Aboriginal people lived on Flinders Island until around 4,000 years ago. If we look through the evolution of language, the strait was occupied by 3 successive waves of Aboriginal people. In total, the Bass Strait has more than 50 islands. Phillip Island is the most populated of these, with close to 14,000 residents. However, it is connected to the mainland by a bridge. Kings Island and Flinders Island are the other famous destinations across the Bass Strait. The external territories. This still is not all of Australia. The government also administers a bunch of territories in the Indian Ocean, like Christmas Island and the Cocos Islands. In the Pacific, Australia governs Norfolk Island, 1,600 kilometres northeast of Sydney. One of Australia's most isolated communities, the island is also one of Australia's oldest territories, settled just 6 weeks after Australia's founding settlement at Sydney. There's also the Ashmore and Cartier Islands and the small matter of New Zealand. Zealandia, beneath the South Pacific, lies a sunken continent that only came to attention in 2017. They called it Zealandia, a long-lost land to the southeast of Australia that could have been the 8th continent of the world. What we see on the surface is this guy we call New Zealand. However, the country represents just a tiny, visible portion of a vast landmass almost half the size of Australia. The northern portion of Zealandia remains connected to Australia, while the southern invisible continent is attached to Antarctica. Before we end the video and make any conclusive remark about Australia's size, let's talk about Hawaii. Hawaii. Where is Hawaii? The answer may seem straightforward. North America, since it is the 50th US state. However, Hawaii is sort of in the middle of everything. and close to nothing. It lies 2,400 miles west of San Francisco, 2,500 miles southwest of Los Angeles, 3,900 miles east of Tokyo, and 4,500 miles northeast of Australia. But how does the Aloha State relate to Australia? Well, geographically speaking, the continent Oceania consists of 4 regions: Australasia, Micronesia, Polynesia, and Melanesia. Out of these, Polynesia is often mapped by a triangle in the Pacific Ocean. This triangle includes places like Samoa, New Zealand, Norfolk Island, and Tonga. But at its northernmost lies the islands of Hawaii. So, while it is administratively governed as part of North America, Hawaii is physiographically and ethnologically part of the Polynesian sub-region of Oceania. Australia is certainly a very interesting continent and apparently much bigger than what we see.